Deputy President. I intend to continue a theme that's been present in many of my speeches since I came to this place in February in relation to matters that are of significant importance to people in agriculture and primary production, and in particular to beef producers of my state of Queensland, and most particular to beef producers in the western aspects and northern aspects of the state who are engaged in grass-fed beef production. Mr Acting Deputy President, I recently undertook a tour of Western Queensland in the company of Senator Brett Mason, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister for Foreign Affairs, and over time we had a series of about 25 meetings that encompassed us being able to engage one-on-one, first-hand, with over 300 people who are involved in the pastime of predominantly pastoral pursuits west of the township of Roma all the way through to Mount Isa. Now, whilst I've acknowledged before, and I will continue to acknowledge again, that there are some aspects of agriculture that are doing well, there are some aspects of enterprises in agriculture that are doing better than others. I would have to declare that the majority of producers in the area that through which we travelled are having a very, very significant struggle. I've put this matter on the record previously, and I will continue to do so until we're able to start, as a government, as a parliament, to be able to respond with some meaningful changes to support this vital sector of our country to get back on their feet, to grow their businesses and return to contributing to the wealth of this nation. Mr Acting Deputy President, there is a belief amongst many that the problems in the bush are confined simply to debt and drought, and that somehow by mitigating the debt circumstances, transferring the type of debt, the application of debt, and rain will restore their fortunes, and that everything will be all right. Well, I can report to you that that's not the case. Drought and debt circumstances for many have compounded their circumstances, but the problems that are facing these producers has been coming for 20 years, and it is about a lack of profitability in their enterprises. These enterprises are reporting, in many cases, zero return on investment, and those that are operating effectively are operating on about 3 or 4%. These are not anecdotal figures, these are figures that have been borne out by many peer-reviewed empirical studies into this issue over the last decade. We have producers who are reporting the same level of income per kilogram for their commodity, for their beef, for their livestock, as they were receiving 20 years ago. And in fact, for those who look at the index in the last 24 months, there have been occasions where there are producers who have sold their entire body of livestock for up to one quarter of prices per kilogram that they received 20 years ago. Many of the properties that I visited, many of the property owners that I spoke to, had completely sold all of their breeding stock, and they are in no position, even with the return of fortune to the weather, even with restructuring their debt with government support in some instances, they are in no position to be able to restock their properties from a financial perspective. Indeed, Mr Acting Deputy President, in the language of producers, many sold breeding livestock, including replacement heifers, for as low as 30 and 35 cents a kilogram, yielding for many prices that barely covered the freight and certainly showed no return for the investment that they'd had in that livestock during the time it had been in their care. We all know that when there is a break in the seasons and surface waters are replenished and the need for investment in fodder and support feed is mitigated, and these people return to the market, they will return to the market with thousands upon thousands of other producers where they will find each other competing for replacement stock, for which, if they're in a position to purchase the stock, will buy stock at 600 or 700% more expensive than what they sold their breeding stock before. So the issues that I found in the bush had to do with droughts, debt, profitability and, in many cases, the impact of a high dollar, consequences of these reduced breeder numbers, meaning that they have their land but they have an incapacity to produce the commodity that typically is their income. They have, and I'm talking about millions of hectares of country in the West where they have limited or no surface water, even if they were to have pasture feed. They have endured now a diminishing lack of extension services funded by state and federal governments, so they are denied, in many cases, that sort of support that they received for many decades to be able to cope better with the circumstances they face. They report very large increases in the number of dingoes and predatory dogs. I'm inclined to think that the dingo is now in the minority. I think that crossbred dogs that have resulted from breeding with dingoes over time, pig dogs and the like, now hold the majority of the dog population in the West. These dogs are much more aggressive in terms of how they operate, and there's reports, and not just one or two, there are many reports of these dogs now pulling down cattle of a size that a dingo would have been incapable of hunting to ground. And unlike dingoes in many circumstances, these dogs might pull down 20 or 30 calves or weaners in the case of a day and consume none. This is a blood sport for these dogs. And these dogs now, on the evidence that they've pursued, are now travelling up to 120 kilometres in the course of a day. So the traditional means of being able to track a pattern of dogs on your property and be able to take, be able to respond to those sort of needs are gone. By the time you've discovered the impact of the work of these dogs, they are anywhere from 50 to 60 kilometres away in some circumstances. Weed infestations are now getting out of control, Mr Acting Deputy President. In some parts, in the area west of Charleville, between Charleville and up around the back way to Stonehenge and Junda, there's massive areas there now, about 50% of the areas in the Mulga, where there are no longer people occupying the properties. Evidence was shown to us during the course of our visit, where in one district alone, where there used to be 9 families on a mail route, there are now none. And on the corresponding mail route that runs north or south, that intersects with the route that I just spoke of, there is 1 family left out of 8, and this evidence was given to us by a producer who went there in 1988. In parts of Aramac, we now, there's a property north of Aramac that had survey work done. There are 26,000 kangaroos on a property of 110,000 acres. It is estimated, professionally estimated, that they are eating up to 50% of the pasture, and the cattle are competing with this. They're competing with the dogs. Fertility rates, and Mr Acting Deputy President, you would know better than anyone in this place. Fertility rates are down around 40%. So it is now impossible for these enterprises, absolutely impossible for these enterprises to service any debt. And mind you, they've got debt. Mind you, they've got debt. They've got their old traditional debt that in many cases was properly invested in developing and being invested in things that increase the productivity of their properties. But more recently, they are borrowing money against the remaining equity in their properties to survive. So in effect, these producers are now subsidising the production of beef in our country. Not all of them, but in the areas that I pass through, which made up about 60% of the land mass of Queensland, they are subsidising the production of beef, and there are others who are enjoying the benefit of that subsidisation. Now, in any other business, one might consider that that's not a very sensible thing to do. Indeed, for many of these producers, it probably is no longer a sensible thing to do. But there comes a point, Mr Acting Deputy President, for these people on the land where everything they have, in fact everything their forebears had, is invested in these rural properties, and the road gets so narrow it is impossible for them to turn around. They are on a collision course, in many cases with bankruptcy, and tragically, and I listened very carefully to Senator Madigan early, and again to Senator Xenophon in relation to mental health. As we travelled through, these people don't talk in statistical terms. They name their neighbours who've committed suicide. This isn't, you know, 0.5% of the population has been subject to mental health issues and have taken their life. They name them, and they name their wives and they name their children. It's their neighbours and the people in their community. Now, I'm not laying that at our feet. I'm not going to lay that at the feet of this government or anyone in it. But if we allow these circumstances to continue, for these circumstances to deteriorate, then progressively we have to take some ownership of the direction in what is happening in rural Australia, and particularly in our state of Queensland. In Queensland, we are suffering drought conditions that haven't been seen since 1902, where properties are experiencing less income per kilogram of beef production than they have done 20 years ago. Production is up. The volume of beef that they're producing on their properties is up because they've invested in pastures, as you would know. Mr Acting Deputy President, they've invested in genetics. They've been able to produce more kilograms of beef per hectare than they did 10 years ago, and indeed 20 years ago. They're not confronted currently with some of the big infrastructure costs, some of the capital costs. Those programs were dealt with years ago. The reticulation of water, the building of dams and turkeys' nests, the fencing of their properties, all these things that increase the productivity of these enterprises. But it has taken them nowhere. It has taken them nowhere because they are being paid the same per kilogram for their commodity as they were, as I've said before, 2 decades ago. They are rewarded as a result of their hard diligence, and I must say, significantly, as a result of the decision to suspend the live cattle trade in 2011 by their Commonwealth Government. I lay that at no one's feet again. That was a decision of this place. In retrospect, it was a very, very ill-conceived decision, and the impact of it is still playing through the balance sheets of these properties and their neighbours all the way down through as far as central Queensland. We have, Mr Acting Deputy President, we have a subprime crisis in northern Queensland and northern Australia. We've had reports with supporting evidence of declines in the value of properties of up to 28%. When you've got a collection of securities where your LVR, your loan value ratio is 70%, which is not unusual if you've got some off-farm securities involved, when you have a collapse of value on the main asset in the body of securities by 28%, you are nudging subprime. And I say there are hundreds and possibly more than 1,000 properties across Northern Australia that are marking time with their banks, with their lenders, waiting for a break in the seasons, waiting for improvements in the commodity prices, waiting for increases in live cattle exports that will impact positively back on the domestic markets. And the banks will then, I think, exercise their rights to sell these properties. And over the next 5 years or more, we are going to see the complexion of production, primary production in my state change significantly, and not necessarily for the better. Whilst I'm not against aggregations of holdings by corporations, Australian or otherwise, their behaviour is completely different to that beehive of family-held enterprises and partnerships and corporations that underpin the viability of our small communities, hundreds of them right across my state, and I'm sure the same applies to New South Wales, Victoria, and indeed, Mr Acting Deputy President, to Western Australia. But I made myself a promise during this trip, and I've tied my right wrist to my left ankle on this promise. It is time for us to draw a line in the sand. I am no longer going to devote my speeches and my time and my energy to establishing what the problems are. These people are tired of hearing from their members of parliament about what their problems are. They're tired of us indicating to them what the circumstances were that brought them into these unfortunate circumstances of their own. And it is time that we now, dug deep, all of us across this place, without regard to partisanship, to start to produce some solutions to support our primary producers. We have to personally, each of us, put a value on primary production for our nation. We each of us have to answer the questions whether we intend to continue to support these small communities and the social infrastructure that goes with them. We need to decide whether agriculture is important to us. We need to accept, I say, the proposition that agriculture and primary production will be the next economy. Long after the gas and coal and other mining resources have made their contribution, iron ore and the like, we will go back to the age of producing soft commodities, predominantly for export, into the Asian market. I say to colleagues in this place, I say we need to spend some of our time, not all of our time. Everyone here has a very important mission. They have their own missions. But a portion of our time needs to be spent thinking about our fellow Australians who have invested their lives in many cases, for many generations, in agricultural pursuits across Western Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, and across all the way across the nation until we get to the beautiful west coast of Western Australia. We need to put a value on it. We need to ask ourselves where they fit. We need to ask ourselves whether we want to join with them in partnership with them as they transition to this new economy, whether we're going to support them to take and exploit these markets in the Asian area, and decisions have to be made with them